We kicked off our new sermon series, New Year, Different Goals. And it can be really tempting at the beginning of the new year, or maybe at the beginning of a new academic year, to think about all that you want to achieve, all the things that you're aiming to do. You might make a to-do list. You might give yourself like a target for, by the end of the year, I want to have done this. You might give yourself a bucket list for 2025. And you might even set targets for what you want to achieve at university or at work or maybe even in the gym. But we want to think, what would happen if we flipped all that thinking? What if our goals looked different this year? And instead, we considered how we might live and how we might spend time gazing on the God that is love. And so this evening, I'd love to talk just for a few minutes about trying less and partying more. Now, you might be sat there thinking, that doesn't sound like a very good discipleship tactic. That doesn't sound like the type of thing you should hear in church. Maybe you think that you should hear, try harder and party less. Maybe you think that that might produce a better outcome if you're trying to follow Jesus. But last week, we were looking at the idea of stopping. We're looking at what would it look like for us to pursue just looking and gazing at Jesus, asking him to make who he is more deeply real to us. And I wonder if, like me, you might find that this passage that we've just read, perhaps a little bit of a challenge. I wonder what you noticed about the story. You might want to have it open in front of you, whether that's on your phone or with a physical Bible that are on the tables. What is it you noticed about Jesus from that story? Did you notice that he was invited to the party? Clearly, the bride and groom didn't think that Jesus was a party pooper. Did you notice his kindness in not allowing the bride and groom to be dishonored because they'd run out of wine? Did you notice that the other people in the story got to participate in the miracle as it happened? And did you notice that the miracle meant that the party could continue? And not only that, it actually got better. The wine got better when Jesus was involved. And so I'd love to invite you this evening to let go of any preconceived ideas you have about who Jesus is or what he might do. And allow yourself space to look at Jesus, be comforted by him, be challenged by him and his spirit as we look at him. And I'd love to suggest two things. We can try less because Jesus never intended our relationship with him to be based on our efforts. And we can party more because Jesus offers life and life in all its fullness. So in the passage today, Jesus was at a wedding, and these were like huge social events in the calendar. It was a chance for the whole community to come together and to celebrate. They'd have enjoyed loads of delicious food and drink. They'd have played music. They'd have been dancing. It'd have been a whole lot of fun. And actually, not like today's weddings where it might just be sort of for an afternoon wedding and then you have a reception in the evening. This might have gone on for like a whole week. It was a lot of fun. But when they run out of wine, Jesus tells the servants to take 6 stone water jars and fill them up. And those jars would have been used by the Jews for ceremonial washing at the temple. It was like a way of making yourself right with God. And it's water from those stone jars that turns into the best wine at the wedding. In the Old Testament, the law, which was part of the reason that these stone jars were used, well, they were actually seen as a gift from God. The law was like something that allowed them to be in relationship with God. It was a way that they could be in relationship with him where previously they couldn't. But the ceremonial washing that they would do, it was like a way of cleaning yourself, both literally by cleaning the dirt off yourself, but also it represented something that you were doing spiritually. But even though for the Jews, the law was seen as this gift that meant they could be in relationship with God, the law also involved something that they had to do. It involved trying hard. They had to do certain things in order to make themselves right with God. And so the 6 stone jars in the story, they represent like a duty to follow the law. And so I've got 6 glass jars here, and I'm going to use these just to represent some of the ways we might think that we ought to try more in order to make ourselves right with God. It can be tempting to think that we need to try hard to fill each of these up. Trying hard to pour our efforts into each thing. Trying hard not to forget one of them. Trying hard to please God by doing them. So I've got a jug of water here, and I don't know about you, I don't know if you can read them all, but they say give, be kind, talk, Bible, invite, and pray. So just this week, I was thinking about trying to get to know God a little bit by reading the Bible, and do you know what I actually thought was, I'm going to pour some of my time this year into reading the Bible, but literally just a couple of days ago, I thought, I've only got 4 minutes. I'll just skim read this chapter so I can tick it off on my Bible reading app so that it says that I've completed it for the day. Totally missed the point of what I was trying to do. We might think that we need to give. So sometimes at the end of each service, we have an opportunity to give towards the work that we believe God's doing and in us and through us. And sometimes, do you know what, I've sat here and I've thought, do you know what, I feel really guilty. I don't really give very much. And because I then feel really guilty, I think, maybe I'll just tap it this Sunday, because then I've done it and I've ticked it off. Sometimes I think, do you know what, I'm not very kind with my words, and I get to the end of the week and I've completely forgotten to pour any of my effort into being kind. And sometimes I think, just like Mads encouraged us to invite someone to come along, my default actually sometimes is to think, I'm going to text my friend on the day that something starts, because then they have a really easy excuse to not come. And I pour in some of my effort, but actually I'm doing it from a place of feeling guilty, like I have to do it, and I feel bad if I don't. I'm sure you might be able to think of a few ways in which you might approach your relationship with God, where you think, I have to do this thing, it's what I ought to do, and the guilt, it piles up. But you know what I've realized? The harder that I try to do something for God, or because I think it earns my way to God, I just recognize there's even more for me to do. I recognize that I've got a very limited ability to try hard. I've got very little left to give. If I try hard at reading the Bible and praying, do you know what? I don't have any more effort left in me to keep trying hard to invite people and to give, because I'm trying from my own strength and my own ability. And it can be really easy to slip into thinking that we need to try hard to get into God's good books or to earn our way to being right with Him. You see, reading the Bible and praying and giving and sharing our faith, inviting people to Alpha or to Youth Alpha, they're all amazing things to be doing. But Jesus never intended it to come from our own efforts. He never intended it for us to have an approach of, if I do these things, it makes me right with God, and if I don't do them, then I'm not in a good relationship with Him. I'm creating like a gap between me and Him if I don't get on and do all these things. But we want to think tonight about, what if we flipped all that? What if we thought about all the things that we think we ought to do and just flipped it on its head? What if we ditched our thinking that our efforts make any difference in relationship with God? What if we poured out the idea that because I feel guilty about it, then I'm going to do it? What if we let go of the idea that anything we do makes us right with God? What if we let go of the idea that we can in any way earn our relationship with God? You see, in the passage, Jesus took something that represented a way of being made right with God by duty and law, by using those stone jars. But he did something transformational as a picture of freedom and celebration. Now, I can't turn water into wine, but I can press a button and some bubbles come out. I'm so sorry that they're not wine, but I wanted to just demonstrate a picture of what it's like to be in relationship with Jesus. What if our starting place wasn't to try harder and to try more, but instead our starting place was to try less and party more, living in response to the freedom that Jesus offers? This passage in John's Gospel, it's an account of a real event that happened. And you know what? As you read it, John is really keen that we understand what it actually looked like. He describes the number of stone water jars. There were 6. He says the day of the week that it was taking place on. It was a real event that happened. But it was also a picture of all that Jesus was going to accomplish on the cross. That wine that were poured out, not just any wine, the tastiest wine that they'd tasted, was a picture of the goodness that Jesus was going to pour out on the cross. And so we can try less rather than party more, because Jesus never intended our relationship with him to be based on our efforts. It was always going to be based on something that he accomplished. His dying on the cross means that we get to do all of these things, but we do it in response to accepting the love and the freedom that he's already won for us. So as that wine came out of those stone water jars, it was a picture of all that Jesus would win on the cross. Rather than regular washing to make yourself right with God, his death on the cross would make us right with him once and for all. Rather than something based on what we do, it would be based on something that Jesus would do. Rather than trying hard to please God, we can live in response to his grace. Rather than trying more to do things in our own strength, we're released to experience his love and his forgiveness and his grace. We get to do things in his strength, not our own. So the miracle, it didn't just represent like a transformational shift because of Jesus' life and death and resurrection, but it also represented a new way of living, a way of living that would bring freedom and joy. In the story, when they ran out of wine, it would have caused great dishonor on the bride and groom and their families. It wasn't just a mistake that they could cover up that would be forgotten about within a few weeks. The communities were really tight-knit in Jesus' day. This would have caused dishonor over their families for a number of years. There would have been shame attached to it. And it just wouldn't have gone away. In this story, we see Jesus take something that would have caused dishonor and would have caused shame, and instead he brought abundant blessing. The miracle resulted in far more of the best wine being produced than would have been consumed at the wedding. And some scholars even think that the wine that was left over at the end would have provided like an income for the bride and groom. So they've gone from a position where they would have had shame for years to a position where they not only got to continue in celebration, the celebrations got better because Jesus was there, but they actually got something like that sustained them in the early years of their marriage. When we invite Jesus into the events in our lives, extraordinary, abundant, life-giving, grace-filled things can happen. And if, like me, you've ever taken the approach that you ought to try more and party less, we're in danger of missing out on the abundant blessing that is available in allowing Jesus into our lives and allowing the fullness of his grace to be real to us. Because if we think that we have to try more, the situations and circumstances that we've faced that have caused us shame and dishonor, they become like a reference point that we use to be like, you need to try even harder next time. Because if our starting place is to try hard, there's always more to try harder with. But in this story, Jesus took what should have caused dishonor and shame, and he brought abundant blessing. When Jesus shows up at the party, there's an abundance of goodness. It demonstrates not just some of God's character, but the new way of living that's on offer in Jesus. Life with Jesus is the best possible life that we can live. The promise is abundant life. It's not that it's always going to be easy, but life with Jesus offers freedom in a way that this world can never offer us. Jesus described what he came to do in John chapter 10, verse 10, like this: I have come that they may have life and life in all its fullness. And so we believe that life with Jesus is the most freeing and fun thing that we can do. And we long for others to come and experience that freedom and that joy. And that's why we host Alpha. That's why we're hosting Alpha Youth. That's why we gather on a Sunday, because life with Jesus is good. And it's worth gathering around him and celebrating who he is. So what if we made it our goal to increasingly become aware that Jesus never intended our relationship with him to be based on our efforts? What if we increasingly pursued a new way of living that Jesus offers that means that we can experience life and life in all its fullness? What if we choose to live in response to his abundant love and made it our goal rather than to try hard and party less, but to try less and party more? The more we sit with the Jesus of this story, the more we might begin to notice there is a party-going, shame-destroying, mindset-flipping, prophetic actioning, abundant blessing Savior who gives us an opportunity to live in response to all that he's already given us. And so the more that we live in response to that Jesus, the more that we might desire to follow him, the more closely we might want to know him. And perhaps thankfulness might begin to pour out in our worship. Maybe you will spend time unmeasured reading the Bible, not just trying to tick it off because you think you ought to. Maybe your prayers will rise more fervently because you don't see it as a thing that you should do. It might be that you experience joy and freedom in a new way because you're no longer living in a way that demands you to try harder, and you get to live in freedom. So I wonder, what would it look like this year if instead of setting that goal to try harder and party less, you flipped it on its head and you tried less and you partied more, living in response to all that Jesus has won for us?